In the early 1890s, Chicago glowed at night like a promise kept. Gas lamps softened the corners of brick buildings. Streetcars clattered past crowds that refused to go home. And in the World's Fair years, the city carried a special kind of electricity, the feeling that history had chosen this place, and that anyone could arrive here and be reborn. On a quiet stretch in Englewood, that same glow fell across an ordinary-looking corner building. Shops on the ground floor. Rooms above. Nothing grand. Nothing with a name you could boast about at a dinner table. But there were nights when people approached its door as if it were an exclusive address, an address you didn't admit to knowing and didn't dare to forget. A traveler stepped inside and felt the first, subtle wrongness, the hush that didn't match the city outside. Not peace. Not comfort. Something closer to control. The hallway seemed to absorb sound. The air carried the faint scent of chemicals and fresh-cut wood. Somewhere deeper inside, a door closed with a soft, final click. And in a city that loved spectacle, this place would become a spectacle shadow, a hotel that fed on secrecy, a story that fed on fear, a legend that outlived the building that inspired it. This is the story of the so-called Murder Castle, how it rose in the World's Fair era, who it seduced with the promise of anonymity, and why the truth vanished while the myth grew teeth. SmithsonianMag.com. 1. To understand why a myth like the Murder Castle could take root, you have to understand what the Gilded Age sold, and what it hid. This was an era that worshipped surfaces. Money arrived faster than manners could keep up. New fortunes bought old rituals, private clubs, fine restaurants, respectable addresses. The message was always the same. If you could afford the right facade, the world would treat you as though you had always belonged behind it. But beneath that polished surface, the country was noisy with contradictions. Cities swelled with migrants and ambition. Factories and rail lines remade entire neighborhoods in a few years. The wealthy demanded order, and the poor demanded a place to breathe. Moral reform movements rose whenever vice became too visible, and political machines learned how to make vice profitable without letting it become inconvenient. Law enforcement, in practice, was often a negotiation. What was punished on one street was ignored on another. A certain kind of man could do things behind closed doors that would ruin a lesser man in public. Chicago, more than most cities, embodied that tension. It was young, proud, and hungry. The Great Fire had burned away the past and left a civic obsession: rebuild bigger, faster, brighter. When the World's Columbian Exposition arrived in 1893, Chicago didn't just host a fair. It staged a national performance of progress. The White City dazzled visitors with neoclassical splendor and electric lights. It offered an America that looked clean, harmonious, inevitable. A place where the future wore white gloves. But outside the fairgrounds, the real city kept breathing, dark, industrial, opportunistic. Visitors poured in, and with them came money, loneliness, and the simple human desire to disappear for a night without consequences. Hotels were supposed to be safe instruments of the respectable world. A bed, a key, a receipt, a clerk who nodded and forgot. But the hotel was also a perfect loophole. A stranger could arrive with a made-up name and leave without being missed, especially in a season when thousands arrived and thousands left. And the press, always the press, turned contradictions into commerce. Newspapers of the era did not merely report. They competed. They hunted attention the way gamblers hunted luck. A story that frightened people could also feed them. A story that scandalized the rich could sell to the poor. A story that blurred rumor and fact could travel farther than a careful truth. Chicago in the World's Fair years was the ideal laboratory for legend, a city overflowing with strangers, money, reform speeches, corruption whispers, and a population eager to believe that behind every polished facade waited a darker room. And then, in that city, one man built a business that depended on the oldest currency of all, trust, and the easiest thing to steal, identity. Because in an era of masks, the most dangerous person is the one who understands how badly you want to wear one. The man most associated with the Murder Castle was not born a monster with a theatrical name. He arrived in the world with an ordinary one, Herman Webster Mudgett. In later years, the legend would call him H. Holmes, as if the initials themselves were a locked drawer. Dr. Holmes, the story went, suggesting education, authority, and the right kind of respectability to put people at ease, just long enough. Holmes was the kind of man who learned early that appearances were negotiable. He could be charming in a room where charm mattered. He could sound educated without sounding arrogant. He could be attentive, sympathetic, almost tender, especially with people who wanted to believe they had met someone extraordinary. But he was also a con artist in the most literal sense, a man who made his living by constructing confidence in others, then spending it. The record of Holmes's life is crowded with frauds, aliases, and shifting relationships. Some sources describe multiple marriages overlapping. Others emphasize the way he moved through towns leaving debts and confusion behind him. What holds steady is the pattern. He treated identity like a tool. Wikipedia. 2. In the early 1890s, he operated in Chicago around the time the city prepared for the World's Fair. Later accounts would attach his story to a building in Englewood, shops below, rooms above, and describe it as a purpose-built trap, a labyrinth designed not for comfort but for control. History. 3. But if you strip away the later flourishes, what remains is still unsettling, because it's simple. Holmes understood systems. He understood that in a booming city, contractors were desperate for work and might accept unusual terms. He understood that clerks processed paperwork by the thousands and rarely remembered faces. He understood that guests in a hotel were transient by design, and that a busy season could swallow a person the way a river swallows a coin. Most of all, he understood that respectability was a costume that came with privileges. A man who looked like a doctor could ask questions a poorer man could not. A man who sounded confident could receive credit. A man who smiled at the right moment could become invisible behind his own charm. And so Holmes positioned himself in exactly the place where invisibility and attention overlapped, a hotel business in a city drowning in strangers. It is tempting, in stories like this, to search for a single motive that explains everything. Greed, sadism, madness, genius. But Holmes doesn't settle easily into a single box, because his story is not only about violence. It is also about modernity. He was a creature of paperwork, of receipts, of keys, of sealed doors. He thrived in a world where a person could be reduced to a name on a register, then erased with the turn of a page. And once you accept that, the building stops being a mere setting and becomes something worse, a physical extension of a personality that saw people as movable parts. Because Holmes didn't need a dungeon to be dangerous. He needed a city that had learned to trust the surface, and to ignore the silence behind it. And Chicago, proud, crowded, dazzling, was ready to give him both. Every legend wants a clean origin point, the moment a man becomes what he becomes. Reality is rarely that neat. Holmes did not transform overnight. He evolved. Like many confidence men, he learned by testing boundaries, watching what people excused, and noticing how often small lies went unpunished. A first turning point, in a story like this, is not a single dramatic event. It is the discovery of a method. At some point, Holmes learned that he could build a life from other people's assumptions. Assumptions like, a man in professional clothing pays his bills. A business owner does not disappear. A guest checking into a hotel will still be alive when the clerk changes shifts. A missing person will be missed quickly, loudly, publicly. And then he learned the counterpoint. In a city full of strangers, those assumptions weaken. One of the reasons the Murder Castle legend caught fire is that it framed Holmes as a theatrical engineer, designing trapdoors and hidden passages like a stage magician with a taste for cruelty. But historians and reputable accounts have noted that many details about the building and the alleged torture house features were exaggerated or even fabricated by sensational journalism. In other words, the myth was designed, too, sometimes by the man, sometimes by the papers. SmithsonianMag.com. 1. And that is the turning point worth focusing on, because it explains why the story became immortal. Holmes understood that the public didn't need proof to feel fear. They needed plausibility. A hotel is plausible. A missing guest is plausible. A con man posing as a professional is plausible. A city overwhelmed by crowds is plausible. A police force that can't keep up is plausible. A newspaper willing to print half-truths because half-truths sell is not only plausible, it is predictable. So the method was not necessarily an elaborate mechanical contraption. The method was the world itself, a booming city, a flood of visitors, and a culture trained to trust what looked respectable. Accounts describe Holmes hiring workers, firing workers, and managing the construction in a way that kept people from seeing the full layout. Whether that was strategic secrecy or ordinary chaos is debated, but the detail persisted because it fit the story people wanted, a man whose business depended on nobody knowing what he was building until it was finished. And once it was finished, or finished enough, he had something rare. Not a mansion with a famous name. Not a club with a membership list. A building that could operate in plain sight without ever being fully understood by the people moving through it. A place that did not need guards with guns to enforce compliance. It only needed doors. A door to enter. A door to separate. A door to silence a question. In the end, the first turning point was not a single crime. It was the moment Holmes realized he could make money from disappearance itself, turning the ordinary anonymity of a hotel into a kind of weapon. And once you can profit from a person's absence, you stop thinking of people as customers. You start thinking of them as inventory. Most criminal enterprises sell something obvious: stolen goods, illegal services, contraband pleasure. Holmes's real product was harder to name, because it looked like ordinary business. He sold lodging. He sold the polite illusion of safety. He sold the anonymity that travelers wanted and respectable society pretended not to need. And, if the darker accounts are even partly true, he also sold a more intimate transaction: the ability to step inside a building and be reduced to a line in a register, then erased. But here is the point where the story turns truly American. Holmes did not operate in a medieval world of castles and torches. He operated in an industrial world of cash registers and locks. The danger wasn't only in what he might do. The danger was in how easy it was to make it untraceable. In the World's Fair era, people came to Chicago to be dazzled. They arrived with baggage and optimism. They arrived believing that the city's bright architecture proved its moral cleanliness. They needed places to stay. Places near transit. Places that looked respectable enough to calm families back home. A hotel could offer that. A hotel could also offer something else: a small private universe governed by the owner. A hotel is a machine. People enter. People leave. Rooms turn over. Money moves from stranger to proprietor. Staff rotate. Guests are temporary. Stories don't have time to harden into questions. Holmes's big idea, as the legend tells it, was to treat that machine not as hospitality but as a system of control. Later writers described rooms that confused rather than comforted. Hallways that did not lead where a guest expected. Doors that opened one way. Spaces designed to isolate. Whether every detail is true is less important than why the details spread. They made sense to an audience beginning to fear what modern buildings could hide. Because the 19th century was teaching Americans something new. In the Old World, danger came from wilderness, storms, visible violence. In the New World, danger could be built into the environment. It could be engineered. It could be hidden inside walls with gas lines and locks. And the beauty of it, if you were a man with no conscience, was that you could profit without needing to be seen doing anything at all. You could sit behind a desk. You could smile. You could talk like a professional. You could collect money for a room. And then, if something went wrong, you could let the city's noise swallow it. Here, the leitmotif begins: silence. Not the silence of a peaceful home. The silence of a place where questions stop at the threshold. The silence of a clerk who doesn't want trouble. The silence of a guest who doesn't want to look foolish. The silence of a city that has too many strangers to keep track of everyone. Holmes's big idea was to Monetize that silence. To make a building that used anonymity as camouflage and trust as a trap. And in a city celebrating the triumph of modern America, it worked, until the machine met a different machine, one built not for secrecy but for exposure. Because every system that thrives in silence eventually creates the thing that destroys it: attention. The building associated with Holmes stood in Englewood, on the south side, an area shaped by growth, transit, and the steady churn of new residents. Later descriptions often imagined the murder castle as a fortress looming over the neighborhood. In truth, it seems to have been more ordinary than legend prefers: a commercial structure with shops on the first floor and rooms above, built to look like a functioning piece of a growing city. History. 3. That ordinariness was part of its power. A building that looks like a storybook castle invites scrutiny. A building that looks like a practical business invites customers. Accounts describe a layout that felt inconsistent, spaces that didn't align, passages that seemed to double back, doors that led to unexpected places. Over time, those descriptions hardened into architecture of horror: secret rooms, soundproof chambers, chutes to the basement, gas lines to suffocate. Some of those details may have kernels of truth. Many are believed to have been inflated by sensational coverage. The building became, in print, a kind of metaphor, a physical maze representing a moral one. But let's stay with what we can say without surrendering to fantasy. Holmes was a con man. Con men understand staging. A successful scam doesn't rely only on lies. It relies on the environment around the lie. Lighting, timing, the right props, the right tone of voice, the right sense that nothing is out of place. A hotel provides those props naturally. A front desk, a register, a bell, a hallway, a key, a locked door, a polite sign that says "Do not disturb." If you wanted to design a space that helped you control strangers, you wouldn't need medieval torture devices. You would need the ability to isolate someone in a room that the rest of the world assumes is private and secure. You would need staff trained to follow instructions and not ask why. You would need, above all, a culture that considers a guest's privacy sacred, so sacred that neighbors don't intrude, and passers-by don't look too closely, and even suspicious sounds are filed away as none of one's business. Visitors later recalled a feeling some buildings have, even when nothing visible is wrong, the sense that the air is stale in a way that doesn't come from weather, the sense that corners are darker than they should be, the sense that a hallway seems to swallow footsteps. They described a quiet that felt deliberate, silence again, not as absence of sound, but as the presence of control. And the building's location mattered. In a growing neighborhood, commerce and lodging were common. Movement was constant. A new face didn't necessarily draw attention. A person could be transient without being suspicious. If Holmes was, as many accounts suggest, using the building for fraud as well as darker crimes, then the structure served another function. It was a hub. A place where paperwork could be handled, where people could be lured, where transactions could occur without leaving obvious traces. A micro-anecdote from later retellings describes a traveling salesman, one of the countless men who moved through Chicago during boom years, checking into a room after a long day. He remembers the key in his hand, the odd way the clerk avoided eye contact, the quiet upstairs that felt unlike any other hotel he'd known. In this telling, he leaves early the next morning, unsettled, unable to explain why. Stories like that spread because they give the audience permission to feel what they already suspect. Some places are wrong before anything happens. Whether that salesman existed exactly as described is less important than what the story reveals about the era's imagination. People were beginning to believe that evil could be designed, that a building could be built not just to shelter life, but to conceal its removal. And that belief, fed by newspapers, gossip, and the city's own anxieties, began to wrap itself around one corner building in Englewood until it was no longer merely a hotel. It was a stage set for fear. And once fear becomes part of the architecture, you don't need a sign outside. People will find you anyway. In the most sensational versions of the murder castle story, the building operates like a private kingdom. Holmes is the king. The staff are loyal servants. The guests are prey. Doors become traps. Hallways become weapons. Reality is usually more mundane, and that is what makes it more frightening. A machine like this does not need constant violence to function. It needs predictability. Guests arrive. Guests pay. Guests move into private rooms. Staff obey routines. Neighbors mind their own business. The city keeps moving. And the owner, if he is clever, lets the system do most of the work for him. Holmes's confirmed conviction was not for a dramatic hotel crime. It was for murder connected to a broader web of fraud and deception, involving an associate named Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes's later confessions were contradictory, and some people he claimed to have killed were later found to be alive, fuel for the argument that the legend expanded far beyond what could be proven. Wikipedia. 2. That matters for the machine, because it tells us what kind of operator Holmes may have been. If you can profit from fraud, insurance schemes, swindles, false identities, then you already understand how to turn people into numbers. Violence, in that world, is not an emotional act. It is an escalation, a way to erase complications, a way to close accounts. In a hotel, complications are easy to bury. A guest who checks in under a false name can disappear with less friction. A guest without close ties in the city is harder to trace. A guest who arrived for the fair may have no one nearby to search quickly. The building's machine, then, is not only physical. It is social. It is the way strangers in a city assume strangers are supposed to be strangers. It is the way busy clerks forget. It is the way shame keeps people from speaking. It is the way a respectable front discourages suspicion. Silence again, doing its work. Accounts describe Holmes cultivating a surface reputation of professionalism. In some tellings, he is Dr. Holmes, a man whose voice suggests authority. People don't argue with authority, they comply with it. One micro-anecdote often repeated in this legend involves a young woman who arrives with ambitions and little protection, someone drawn to the city by the fair's promise. The story says she finds work or lodging connected to homes, and then becomes harder to locate in a city overflowing with newcomers. Whether or not a particular version is verifiable, the pattern is historically plausible. Thousands arrived, many lives were unstable, and the city's growth created gaps that predators could exploit. Another micro-anecdote, more about myth than murder, tells of a local resident who passes the building nightly. He notices deliveries at odd hours. He notices the way certain workers seem to vanish from the job. He hears rumors of rooms that change, of doors that lead nowhere, of smells from the basement that aren't quite right. He never calls the police, not because he approves, but because he has learned what people learn in machine-run cities. You don't start trouble with a place that seems protected. A third micro-anecdote belongs to the press. A reporter hears gossip and realizes it is everything a newspaper needs. Mystery, fear, a respectable villain, a building that readers can imagine. The reporter begins to assemble fragments into narrative. The story runs, people react, and suddenly the building is no longer a local oddity. It is a symbol. The public begins to know things it cannot prove, because the story has the shape of truth. That is how the machine feeds itself. First, the building generates secrets. Then the secrets become rumors. Then the rumors become print. Then print becomes profit. And the most brilliant and most damning part is this: even if the worst details are exaggerated, the myth still creates damage. It creates fear. It creates attention. It creates the sense that the world contains hidden rooms where you can be erased. And once people believe that, they behave differently. They speak in whispers. They warn their children. They buy newspapers. They tell friends. They keep the story alive. The building, in that sense, becomes less important than what it represents: the suspicion that modern life has created new ways to vanish. By the time the machine reaches full speed, it hardly matters how much is fact and how much is embroidery. Because the public is no longer asking, "Did this happen?" They are asking, "Could it happen?" And the most dangerous stories are the ones that make the answer feel like yes. If you want to understand why the murder castle story became immortal, imagine Chicago during the World's Fair. In the evenings, the city carried two moods at once. One was triumph, crowds returning from the fairgrounds, faces lit by electric spectacle, voices charged with the belief that the future had arrived in white stone and bright light. The other was hunger, the quieter craving that follows triumph, when a person wants something private after being part of something public. A drink, a secret, a room with a lock, a moment where no one is watching. On a peak night, one of those nights the legend loves, Englewood feels slightly removed from the fair's glamour but close enough to catch its spillover. The streets are busy with the practical commerce that feeds a city's dreams. People are tired. People are excited. People are alone in a crowd. A guest arrives at the building. He is not a hero, not a villain, just a man who assumes the world is built to serve reasonable expectations. The first floor feels ordinary: shops, small signs, the smell of goods and street dust. Then he steps toward the stairs, toward lodging, and the temperature seems to shift. The hallway is dimmer than he expects. The air has the faint scent of cleaning products or chemicals. The sound of the city becomes distant, as if the building has swallowed it. At the desk, the operator is present, or at least his presence is. A clerk checks names, accepts payment, offers a key without unnecessary conversation.
No worms. No familiarity.
Only function. And upstairs, the building becomes what the story needs it to be: a place where a guest is alone behind a door that only one person truly controls. In the most sensational retellings, this is where the architecture performs. Doors that lock from the outside. Hallways that twist. Rooms that confuse. Vents that deliver gas. Traps that drop bodies. Those details are contested, and serious historians have warned that the castle was transformed by yellow journalism into something closer to a horror novel than a strictly documented crime scene. SmithsonianMag.com. 1. But the emotional truth, the reason the story endures, does not require every mechanism to be real. It requires only a single, chilling plausibility: that a person could enter a hotel and be swallowed by the city. Because the fair brought thousands of such opportunities. Consider the stakes not in money, but in meaning. A World's Fair is a celebration of order. It insists that humans can build perfection. It insists that progress is clean, engineered, visible. A story like The Murder Castle is the dark twin of that belief. It insists that humans can also engineer disappearance, that progress can be used to hide chaos, that a building can be designed not to elevate humanity, but to exploit it. On the peak night, the legend offers its cruelest seduction, the idea that horror did not lurk in some distant wilderness. It stood in a neighborhood, behind a door, in a city where everyone was celebrating civilization. One micro-anecdote told in later accounts describes a guest hearing footsteps outside his door in the early hours. Slow, deliberate, stopping and starting, as if someone is listening. He holds his breath. He hears nothing else. The hallway feels too quiet. When the footsteps move away, he tells himself it was only another guest, only the normal sounds of a hotel. He does not open the door. He does not speak to anyone in the morning. He checks out. He goes back to the fair and tells no one, because what would he even say? Silence again, doing what it does best, protecting the story from scrutiny and protecting the predator from consequence. And somewhere in the building, the operator moves like a host. In many retellings, he is calm, almost detached, a man who understands that panic is messy and mess is dangerous. If he is committing crimes, he cannot afford to look like a criminal. He must look like management. Outside, the city roars with joy. Inside, the building offers a different lesson, that modern life can hide the darkest transactions behind the simplest routines. By dawn, the streets refill with ordinary motion. A guest who checked in may not appear again. A name on a register may be crossed out. A rumor may begin. And the world outside will keep celebrating. Because the peak night isn't only about what happens inside the building. It's about what the city allows to happen by not looking too closely. And that is why the peak always contains the seed of destruction. The more perfectly a secret operates, the more violently it shatters when attention finally finds it. No machine runs forever. Even the best con depends on two fragile resources, time and trust. Holmes's world, if the broad outline is accepted, began to crack not because Chicago suddenly grew moral, but because systems collide. Fraud draws investigators. Money draws rivals. Disappearances draw questions. And newspapers, once they sense a story, do not let go. The first cracks are often invisible to outsiders. A partner grows uneasy. A clerk hears too much. A neighbor notices patterns. A small lie becomes a larger one. A payment fails to clear. A name appears twice in two different places. Then comes the enemy force, sometimes a person, sometimes an institution, sometimes a change in the political air. In Holmes's case, the confirmed legal collapse centered on murder tied to fraud and an accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes was convicted for Pitezel's murder, and the case also involved the deaths of Pitezel's children. Holmes's later confessions inflated his legend while undermining his credibility, because he claimed murders that could not be verified and even included people who were still alive.
Википедия 2.
That contradiction is essential to the story's larger theme, myth feeding on truth until the two are difficult to separate. The press became both enemy and accomplice. Enemy, because exposure threatens any operator whose business depends on discretion. Accomplice, because sensational stories can also distract from precise facts, turning a case into entertainment, making the public hungry for horror rather than accountability. Investigators, in cases like these, face a practical problem. A conman's life is made of paper. Addresses, names, signatures, receipts. The more a man lies, the harder it is to pin him down. He becomes a shifting target. And yet, the act of investigating itself generates noise. Questions get asked. Rumors spread. People who were silent begin to speak, sometimes for justice, sometimes for attention, sometimes out of fear that they will be associated with the scandal if they do not distance themselves quickly. Another micro-anecdote from later retellings describes a local policeman arriving at the building on a minor complaint, something small, mundane. He steps inside and feels the same wrongness others described, a controlled quiet, a sense that the building is listening. Nothing illegal is visible. The owner is polite. The paperwork is clean enough. The policeman leaves, frustrated, carrying only a feeling. That feeling later becomes evidence in the public imagination, because the public confuses intuition with proof once a legend is born. Cracks widen when the operator loses control of narrative. A conman can manage one victim at a time. He can manage a small circle of associates. He can even manage local gossip. But he cannot easily manage national fascination. Once the story begins traveling, once it becomes the murder castle, once it becomes the dark mirror of the White City, the operator becomes less a man and more a character. And characters do not get the benefit of nuance. Holmes becomes, in print, a symbol of everything people feared about modern America: science without ethics, professionalism without morality, progress used as camouflage. At that point, the enemy is not only law enforcement. It is the public's appetite. Because the public doesn't want a careful accounting. The public wants a myth that satisfies the feeling that something was wrong beneath all that white plaster and electric light. And when a society decides it wants a particular story, the story itself becomes a force, one that pushes investigators, prosecutors, and reporters toward the version of events that sells best. Which raises a terrible question. When the enemy arrives, is it arriving to reveal truth or to package it? And if the story becomes more profitable than the facts, what incentive remains to keep the facts clean? The machine begins to fail not only because people are closing in, but because the machine has created too much attention to operate quietly. The silence that protected it now becomes suspicious. The door that once seemed discreet now seems guilty. And once a building becomes famous for what might have happened inside, it is only a matter of time before someone decides it must end. If not for justice, then for the public's need to see a monster punished. Because myths demand a spectacle. And the bigger the myth, the more dramatic the fall must be. The fall of the murder castle story is not neat, because the story itself is not neat. Holmes was executed in 1896, hanged after his conviction related to murder and fraud. Wikipedia. 2. That much is solid ground. But the building, the stage the public could point to and call evil, did not vanish with him. According to multiple accounts, the structure was gutted by a fire in 1895, after Holmes's arrest, reportedly set by an unknown arsonist. It was later rebuilt and used for ordinary purposes, including post office use, until it was ultimately demolished decades later.
Википедия 2.
That detail, too, is deeply American. We want evil to end in a single scene: a raid, a trial, a hanging, a dramatic demolition. But cities do not work that way. Cities repurpose. They pave over. They replace old stories with new utility. The public wants the building to become a ruin, the physical embodiment of sin collapsing under its own weight. But the neighborhood needed commerce more than it needed symbolism. So the structure lived on, in altered form, wearing new masks. Imagine how strange that must have felt for people who believe the legend. To walk past a building you think is soaked in horror and see people buying stamps, collecting mail, conducting normal life. To see the same walls used for mundane transactions. It would feel like a refusal. A refusal of the city to participate in moral theater. A refusal of reality to match the story. And yet, the myth did not fade. In fact, the building's survival may have helped the myth grow. A living building becomes a container for imagination. People can point to it. They can tell stories. They can swear they felt something there. They can insist the air was colder, the hallway too quiet. Silence again, but now the silence is historical. A silence created by the lack of perfect records, by the loss of witnesses, by the mixing of fact and newspaper invention. Holmes's confessions poured fuel on that fire. He claimed to have killed dozens. He contradicted himself. Some of his claims were demonstrably false. Historians have emphasized that much of what the public knows about Holmes and the murder castle was shaped by sensational journalism and later retellings, turning uncertain details into confident folklore. SmithsonianMag.com. 1. That means the fall happens in layers. The legal fall, a conviction and execution. The reputational fall, a national scandal, a monster story. The architectural fall, fire, repair, repurposing, demolition. And finally, the cultural fall, or cultural survival, depending on how you see it. The myth becomes the primary product, more durable than bricks. When the building finally disappeared, demolished or replaced, the public did not lose the story. The public gained freedom. Now the legend could become anything, because it no longer had to fit a specific floor plan. It no longer had to answer to physical constraints. With the building gone, the myth could expand without argument. A modern office. A post office. Ordinary traffic. A corner that looks like 100 other corners. No plaque that says, "Here stood the House of Horror." No preserved hallway to confirm or deny the stories. Just a location the imagination can haunt. A final micro-anecdote, reported in later popular accounts, describes visitors standing near the site years afterward, trying to feel something. They speak more quietly than necessary. They glance at the windows as if expecting eyes behind them. They listen for sounds that cannot exist anymore. Even when there is nothing left, they behave as if the building can still enforce its rules. That is the most lasting victory of a myth built on fear. It teaches people to police themselves. It teaches them to whisper. It teaches them to believe that what they cannot see may be more real than what they can. And that is why the murder castle did not truly die when the rope tightened. It died when the city erased its shape. And it lived, at the same moment, because the public finally had nothing left to argue with except the story. Because you can demolish a building, but you cannot demolish a rumor once it has learned how to feed. Today, you can stand where the building once stood and feel how thoroughly a city can override its own memory. The street looks like a street. The corner looks like a corner. The world moves with the blunt practicality that keeps cities alive. People go to work. People run errands. Cars pass. Nothing in the air announces a legend. And yet, if you know the story, you catch yourself listening. You listen for the creak of stairs that no longer exist. You imagine a hallway swallowing sound. You picture a door closing softly, too softly, as if it was designed to keep the world out. Silence again, this time the silence of absence, the silence that comes after demolition, when history has no physical anchor and must survive as narrative alone. The murder castle myth endured because it solved a psychological need. It gave shape to anxieties the era couldn't comfortably name. Fear of the stranger, fear of the city, fear that progress can hide rot, fear that respectability is a costume worn by people who understand how to manipulate it. It also endured because it was profitable. For the press. For storytellers. For tourists. For the public itself, which often prefers a satisfying horror story to a complicated truth. So what are we left with? A man with a record of deception and murder, whose most notorious association, the castle, is wrapped in exaggeration and contested details. SmithsonianMag.com. 1. A city that needed a monster to balance its bright fairy tale. A building that vanished, leaving only coordinates and whispers. And questions that do not go away, because they are not really about one corner in Chicago. How much of our history is evidence? And how much is a story that paid well? When fear becomes entertainment, who profits and who vanishes? Do we chase truth? Or do we chase the version that feels more satisfying? The White City is gone. The hotel is gone. The era that produced both has passed into photographs and dust. But the legend still moves through the modern world the way it moved through the Gilded Age. Quietly, efficiently, feeding on the oldest human instinct. The need to believe that evil leaves a recognizable address, even when the street has forgotten.